In this episode, we're going to be talking about short stories, short fiction, and the techniques and tools you'll need to master the art form. Welcome to the Writer's Gym. The Writer's Gym podcast. Build creative confidence and grow your writing life with Rachel Knightley and Emily Inkpen. Rachel Knightley.
Hello.
Hello. You have both written short fiction and had your short stories published. Mm-hmm. I want to start by asking you, is it a form that you enjoy?
Yeah. No.
Okay.
Well, I knew this would be the answer, and probably harking back to a previous podcast, I thought there might be a little bit of disagreement and conflict over this. So, fair to say, Rachel, you have had collections of short fiction published.
I have. I'd like to go back a lot further for why I love it. The first short story I had published was in a spiral-bound little anthology. It was a company that had an awards thing happening at my university, Roehampton, where I now lecture. And I was a BA student, and I submitted a short story for that, and I won the Promise Prize for Children's Fiction for this short story, and I still love that short story. It was called the Promise Prize, not because of the word promise meaning showing promise, although that was what it implied. It was because of the Promise Recovery Centre, which was an addiction recovery centre, and I did a bit of work with them subsequent to that. The story happened over one moment. It was two teenagers seeing somebody in a park, and somebody realising something both about their relationship with the other teenager and about the world. And I didn't consciously know that I was doing what short stories are best at doing, which is a moment. But I instinctively went for that, and I was making myself laugh, and I was sharing my insecurities. I was taking bits of me, giving them different names and different examples of what was causing that emotion. And I was having a really good time. And I didn't do short stories for years after that. I went and did my MA and wrote a novel that I didn't publish, and then got distracted by various things for many years, and only have just come back really in the last 6 years, 7 years to writing. And I did then have published short story collections. And now back to long form, but will always love the short story for that moment, for that finding a moment either of change or of clarity. Love it.
What about you, Emily?
So I am naturally a long form writer. I know this about myself. When I do short stories, what they do is not a moment. See, this is the problem. My short stories that have been published have followed almost a hero's journey in a very, very tight space. They have a beginning, middle and end. An adventure happens. They come back round to the beginning. And it all happens within a few thousand words. And it's very rare that you can tell a full story like that in a very tight space. But I guess I don't know how to tell a different type of story. Like, I've tried telling the moments and it hasn't clicked with me. So yes, the short stories tend to be like mini novels within a few thousand words. And I think that's where I have trouble, because it's really difficult to do that. But my brain naturally settles on that form of storytelling. It's something that I would have to really work at to get good at. I've had a few stories published. There was one story that I wrote that didn't do those things. And people's comments on it were, I want to read the rest of this novel. You know, because it was called Cerebra and the Dragon. And it was published in the Light Anthology, which was for Mind charities. It was a charity anthology. And it is one of my favourites. It's about a mechanical dragon on a spaceship. And it ends on a sort of, I guess it ends on a cliffhanger. And it's exactly how I wanted it to be. But I guess it does read like the prologue or chapter 1 of a book.
It's a glorious thing, I have to say.
Oh, you've read it, yes.
and yeah, we will. I think for this one we will definitely put links, because you know, short stories. I've read short stories from both of you and really enjoyed them. But I think there's an interesting dynamic in this podcast because we haven't had many of these discussions where one of you feels a lot less confident about the topic than the other. And I think that's going to make for quite an interesting discussion. And I think maybe we'll try and, change your mind and make you more enthusiastic about it.
I mean, I am enthusiastic about short stories. I love it when I read a short story that is just beautiful. It's like a jewel. That's what I imagine short stories to be like. Like a novel is a whole crown, but a short story is a jewel that is, like a solitaire in its own setting. It speaks for itself. It is standalone. It is beautiful. I just really struggle with them. And as a result, I feel like all the writing advice is start with short stories, then move to novellas, then move to a novel. And I started with an epic trilogy and I worked sort of backwards from there. Short stories have happened in between whiles, but yeah, I just really struggle with them. I just do not sit happily in that space.
And that is an important thing, isn't it? That guidelines are there to help people. They are not there to tell them what to do for their own sake. And if something doesn't work for you, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I mean, there's all the difference in the world between going, this is an interesting form that I love reading. It's not how my mind naturally works, but I will have a play with this. I will see what I find in it. And the less self-confident, less curious and more shouldified, which is, I should be good at this or I should do this. And actually, we will all be different. That's the glory of it.
Yeah.
But if it's a toy, brilliant. It needs to be a toy shop, not an exam room.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I was on LinkedIn of all places, and people there like to give advice, don't they? That's basically what it is. I find it very toxic. They just like to tell people how it should be and give all of these inspirational quotes and things. And one that made me really angry was this: you need to start with short stories if you're going to write a novel. And I was like, well, that put me off novel writing for a long time because I didn't think I was ready, and I can't stand short stories. I can't write them very naturally. And yeah.
I had a similar experience with script writing in that I was within a situation where it was quite an insular group of writers, and I spent a lot of time not realising that what I had done in my head was, I have to make these people like what I'm doing in order to go and do something bigger. It was never conscious, but seeing it now, there was always the opportunity of going, and this might just not be for me.
Yeah.
Making these people like what I do is completely irrelevant. There are bigger goldfish bowls out there, and there is a lot more swimming to be done there. Now that's obvious. It didn't feel obvious at the time, but I became a better writer when I stopped trying to be the writer that people that happened to be around me thought was a better writer than what I was. Yeah. And then I went off to find what I was.
Yeah.
We'll come back to short fiction and the whys, wherefores and hows of it.
Oh, them.
But, I mean, just to start, I want to think about where short stories fit into this sort of range of lengths of fiction. So I think we have flash fiction, short stories, novellas, novels, and Emily Penn style large trilogies.
Timelines of 60 plus years.
Yes, yeah. So are you, either of you, aware of any particular definition of what a short story is?
Numbers are always a bit subjective, but the BSFA recently introduced a new category to the awards, which is shorter fiction. And this goes in between short story and novella, because there were instances where people were writing 10 to 15,000 word stories, and they were being compared to 2,000, 3,000 word stories. And technically, I mean, that's longer than what is classed as a short story. It's far exceeding a lot of the word limits that will be, given by magazines and things, who will often have a cap of 4,000 words. So the idea of judging a short story of 4,000 words alongside a story of 15,000 words, which is potentially a couple of chapters, you can have a few chapters in a shorter fiction. And then novella is sort of 20,000 words to 40,000 words-ish. And I can't remember the exact word number, which is very bad, but I know the ballparks. Okay, so you've got, You've got short stories, which are up to like 8,000 words, I think. Some publications will take that, especially anthologies. You've got shorter fiction, which is upwards from there to about, 20,000 words. And then you've got novellas that are like 20,000 words to 40,000 words. And then you've got novels and,
bigger than
things. And I think that's the word limit of the categories. You should definitely check this out. Do not take that as gospel. But that's roughly the sort of,
we can put the
ballpark.
gospel in the show notes.
Yeah. Oh, and
Yes.
flash fiction. Flash fiction, I think, is like 500 words or less, often. I mean, all of this is subjective because certain anthologies will classify a flash fiction can be up to like 800 words. Normally it's hundreds of words as opposed to thousands of words. That's the sort of rule of thumb. A flash fiction can be 3 sentences.
I'm going to just name drop our previous guest, because another one, just going smaller and vaguely relevant, is that one of the things that Nigel Planer does in Making Other Plans is use haikus in their traditional way, which is not just the number of syllables, but the third line upstages, turns around everything you've read before.
Yes.
And he's talked about how structure is something that he enjoys and the puzzle of it. It's a great thing to do. Now, I don't see myself by any stretch as a haiku writer or as a flash fiction writer, but knowing that and letting myself enjoy it anyway is how I then have discovered the odd thing that was a heck of a lot more able to stand on its own feet than I thought it was going to be. So I am a big fan of experimenting in areas you think aren't your home and having a very nice holiday.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So compared then to writing a novel, and you've touched on this already, Emily, do you see the short story as an exercise in brevity and being succinct? And therefore is the challenge to the writer one of telling a story in few words? Or should we treat them as something different, not necessarily about brevity, but about telling different sorts of stories?
It's about the opportunity, isn't it? That if you come into it thinking curiosity, then you might do all of those things. I think the problem comes when you've heard something that makes you feel insecure rather than curious. So taking your example, Emily, about that advice, which was actually it sounds like it was phrased or felt in a way that was too solid, as in not if it helps you, you could try this, but you must do that, which is a whole other thing. And it's the tone of voice as much as it's anything that if I am ever giving any tips or advice to anybody, it is from the perspective of I'm trying to find out more about you as a writer, what you want and how you need to get into that. So if you come to a short story going, I wonder what happens if I do this, you may very well discover something that absolutely lights your day up that might go on to be published. But it is about doing that rather than I have to be interesting or I have to follow the rules. Because if I'd gone into my early ones going I have to be interesting and I have to follow the rules, wouldn't have got that Promise Prize, which I am thinking back to because it encouraged me as a 24, 25-year-old writer that actually this is fun, and if you just explore what you're thinking about, you can share it with other people. That's a good invention. That was how I got into short stories, really. And yes, it took me a while to come back, but it's definitely how I got in there. So it's about finding which key fits the lock for you, I think. That you can do all those things Chris said, but you can also just go, here is an idea in my head, I'll see where it takes me, and then I'll see how long that feels. You don't have to know how long something is going to be.
Yeah.
It's like when people are new to a workshop, and I will say something like, if it's writing prompts, I will say, let yourself be drawn to one of these words, and maybe they're symbols or maybe they're objects or whatever they happen to be. And you've got this many minutes, and I'm asking you to think on the page, and that's the only thing I'm asking you. You don't need to know what's going to happen. You just need to be able to think on the page and let yourself be curious. Somebody will always say, if it's new, how many words should this be?
Yeah.
Because immediately fear needs its language. And I will always say, I don't know. And neither do you, and isn't that wonderful? Because then we find out.
Yeah.
Toy shop, not exam room.
Yeah.
I think sometimes as writers we feel that short fiction requires us to make sacrifices. I suppose, lots of forms of writing do that, and we often talk about audio drama. The sacrifice there is the visual elements of storytelling.
Yeah.
Short stories, it seems to me, the things that we might need to sacrifice would be prolonged character development over a longer period, for example, maybe long descriptive passages. What do you two think are the sacrifices that short stories require of us?
See, I think that for me, the main sacrifice is the slow burn and accepting that this is just a slice of a journey as opposed to the whole thing. For me, if I sort of care about it, I want to tell the whole thing. You know, as I start writing, it expands around the point that I'm making or the point of the individual piece. A couple of the stories I've written, for instance, they haven't got a book yet. But they exist in the same universe as the Dex Legacy, but in a very different place. Nobody knows how they tie in, that's all in my head, but they exist there. And there is politics and there is history and all of those things. That's all happened because I've written the short stories. Those short stories are not done because they fit into that wider world. They become seeds. And then the temptation is to then write beyond them. So I guess the sacrifice for me, and I call it a sacrifice, you know, I mean, it's not really a sacrifice. It's, you know, you say like sacrificial lamb or something on the altar. No. It's more like when we're talking about audio drama, I say, you know, like limitation is the mother of invention. And you take the limitations and you make it work for whatever you're working on. You make it an opportunity to be creative. For me, so far, short story writing has not offered freedom in creation. It's only offered limitation. And that is, I think, where my state of mind in it comes from. And that's not to say it will always do that. But so far, that is what it's done.
Yeah, I think having come in to discover what the advice then turned out to be, as in another way of saying it is it's one photograph rather than the whole film, or it's one moment rather than the whole time. There's a million ways of saying the same thing, really. But at the same time, you don't know when you're going to discover something. Like you said, the limitations are the mother of invention. And if you take something like The Jumblies, Edward Lear, or it's children's fiction. It's an epic poem for children. It's fantasy. You could even go and argue science fiction if you could be bothered. That's a longer argument. But there are elements of other things. And it might be either that you discover there is a novella sitting there wanting to be a novella, or that there is a novel that this is a first draft of, or that you do have one moment from it. Let's say an anthology just happened to appear tomorrow that said, we want this exact thing. You're going to chuck it in. It might be a short story, but it's not the end of its story. Like you say, it is all part of your own universe.
Yeah.
I suppose, going back to your actual question, sorry about that, that was quite some time ago. Right. For me, it's a glimpse through the window. It's maybe looking at one picture. There are paintings in the National Gallery that I can just stand in front of for ages and still be seeing something new in. And the really good short stories that I enjoy reading absolutely do that to me. And I guess the elephant in the room here is also I chose to do a short story cycle rather than a collection for the last one, where each one does exist entirely on its own and each character sees the world entirely differently, but you do look at people from other angles, so it's almost a series of pictures. And it has certain things in common with a novel, but it's not a novel. And I liked experimenting with form in that way. That worked for my concept of these generations and these people and how they knowingly and unknowingly mess up and light up each other's lives. It was the right format for what I was asking and saying about the world, my place in it. So, you know, that you do find these ways of bending the machinery to fit the design. That's fun. But if it's not fun, then go play with a different toy, because it does need to be toys, not exam. Really does.
Well, let's flip then and say more about some of the benefits of writing short fiction. And I think that one that's often quoted, actually, let me throw two in that are often quoted and then you can comment on them. So one is getting something finished. Might be a quicker and easier route if you're a writer who's never finished something before. A short story might give you that. And the other might be possibly an easier first route to publication, because there are lots of anthologies, magazines that will take short stories.
And communities that you meet through coming into those.
Yeah. So would those be two really good reasons for a writer having a go? Because neither of those really is about the form, is it? They're more...
It's about the opportunity.
Progression as a writer, aren't they?
Yeah. And again, they are opportunities. They exist there as opportunities. I think depending on how much of a beginner you are, you will probably already have a sense of the kind of things that are calling to you, that you are curious about. And if you are not in any way curious about short fiction... I'm going to be honest, I'd still say have a go anyway, play with the toys, but get to know how the bits work and how it feels, and you can surprise yourself like I've done with songwriting. I did not think I could write a song and then did this, that and the other. You know, it does happen, but at the same time, only you can experience that. So yes, it's definitely an opportunity. Yes, it opened doors for me. It made me get to know myself as a writer, get to meet lovely useful communities, people, friends. You know, I would not change a thing, but at the same time I did always know I was interested in the novel, so coming back to the novel now is not a surprise to me. That was always there. Personally, there are two finished in very, very heavy severe quote marks novels I didn't publish that I wrote during my MA and after. And what I've learned through writing the short story collections and mixing with other writers and being coached as a writer and coaching writers and all of this, I've learnt so much more about what it is to be human, what it is to fear things, what it is to want things. All of that, I can absolutely see it paying off in the rewriting and editing that I'm doing now. And I'm sure that will be true forever. I'm sure we all keep growing. But I think it all comes from getting into practice of listening and experimenting with what interests you.
What do you think, Emily? Because, I mean, that was a route to publication for you, wasn't it? The short story.
Yes, it was. When it comes to my writing journey, I finished my first novel and edited it and all the rest of it and submitted it to agents. And so I was actually a repped novelist before I got my first short story published, which is very unusual. And, so I really came at it differently. One thing I will say is that some people set out to write a novel with an idea that should be a short story.
Yes.
And then try to string it out. The idea needs to be the length that it needs to be. Stretching a short story into a novel is not doing the story justice. Trying to cram a novel into a short story is not doing it justice. If you have a novella and you're trying to double the word count so that you can submit it as a novel, it's not doing it any good. You need to do it in the novella format. It's about opportunity, but it's also about, I think, knowing the story that you're trying to tell.
And the right way of telling it.
And the right way of telling it. And not being afraid to be like, no, this is just a short story. I don't need to be a novelist. I don't need to stretch it further than what it is, because some people are like, oh no, I want to write a novel. But the idea just isn't there, and it's not going to be long enough to mean something novel length. You're just putting fluff in. You're just elongating it for no good reason.
Unless you find you're not. I mean, sometimes you'll go into that and then you will genuinely find something and it will become a novel. But if that's not happening, there's no reason it should be.
Yeah, exactly. Like the number of people I've seen on social media saying, oh, my book is 60,000 words and I need to add 20,000 words to it and I don't know what to say. It's like, well, if you've got to the point where it's done and it's 60,000 words and you're looking for things to make up 20,000 words, it doesn't sound to me like it's going to be any good if you're just finding fluff. The thing with being a writer is that normally what you want is to have too much material.
Yes.
And then be editing it down into a tighter form. You don't want to have too little material and be adding stuffing to it. Slows it, it makes it heavy, it makes it just like you're wading through fluff. Which, if you're in a toy store, that's really fun. But if you're reading a book, it's not. So it's about making something tight and pacey. That's also a good way to think about it. Tight and pacey. And I don't know if I'm answering the question here at all, but I am making a point of sorts, which is, the story is the story, tell the story. For me, I think one of my challenges is that because I'm a natural long story writer, I try to write big stories and force them into very tight spaces. And that either works or it doesn't. And on a very few occasions, I think it's worked. And I've managed to do it. And I actually passed one short story that got published recently. And I passed it on to a friend of mine who does write short stories to just have a look at, to, beta read. And his feedback came back as, I don't know how you've done it, but you've written a novel in 3,000 words. And I'm like, I know, this is what I do. It's the only way I know how to write. And it's really hard. And
so pick your form.
And pick your environment, because there will be readers for it. I mean, where I went wrong in my insecurities was when I heard people I was near go, don't write about these subjects or don't write in this way. I was young enough and insecure enough to go, I have to try and write the thing that they want me to write, which wasn't necessarily what they were saying. It might have just been I wasn't in the environment for me. And that's what it sounds like you're doing, Emily, is you're exploring, you're finding these different things. And if you're enjoying them, then you'll bring them to their new homes, whatever those homes are. We'll only really do that through genuine exploration, not through trying to fit a box for its own sake.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I suppose where I was going with that was really exploring, based on that earlier question about, word counts and what constitutes a short story and what constitutes a novella. There's more to it than the number of words, isn't there? There is, some things will suggest themselves as short stories. Some short stories may not feel like short stories if you are someone who reads a lot of short fiction. So I guess really it's up to you to find a natural home for the idea that you have. And there's lots of different places for it. If you think it's a short story, read a lot of short stories.
And communicate, don't be afraid. And this is another thing that took me ages. Don't be afraid to ask for advice. Yes, we're giving advice a bit of a bad name when it's phrased rather like an order on LinkedIn and things like that. But at the same time, asking people's opinions, asking people's help is okay. Find the people in your network. There might be opportunities around the corner that you find through asking people.
I'd also like to just add here, write the story. Don't write a novel or a short story or something. If you've got a story to tell, that's the main thing. Say what you set out to say.
Yeah.
Yes.
And whether that's a short story, a flash fiction, a short fiction or a novella or a novel or an epic trilogy.
Or a haiku.
Say what you want to say and accept it for what it is.
And perhaps see what you've got at the end of that process.
And see what you've got at the end of that process.
See what it comes back and says to you.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, I set out to write a novella, which was going to be the novelisation of the first season of The Dex Legacy. It's 100,000 words. That was me setting out to write a novella. The original trilogy... That's brevity for me. The original trilogy is just shy of 500,000 words. Now, I didn't set out to write 500,000 words. I set out to tell the story. And I knew where I was going, and I knew where I needed to get to, and I knew it was going to be long. I did know that. I knew it was going to be, as Chris hates the term, but I knew it was going to be a journey. Okay? From beginning to end, it was going to...
If only we could get that facial expression on audio.
Yeah, right, yeah. So I knew it was going to take a while, and I knew that I wanted to sort of get it. Oh gosh, he's really upset.
Yeah, he's really upset now with the word journey.
Yeah. I knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't know how long it was going to be. I told the story. It's that long. It's good. I mean, at some point it's going to get edited. But when I edited book 1 and I followed that agent's advice that I think I've mentioned before in a previous episode, where he said, you're going straight into the action, we need more space. What he did was add 30,000 words to the novel. So in the editing phase, sometimes you do add words to make it make sense and to make it better and more rounded as a story.
When you find the things that were so obvious in your head, you haven't noticed that you haven't actually written them.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, you need to actually convey that to a reader. So I would say set out to tell the story. Don't set out to write a novel.
Yeah.
with this
or
idea,
a short story,
or a short story with this
yeah.
idea. It just helps so much, because otherwise what you get is a short story stretched into a novel, or a novel crammed into a short story, or, you know, like, it's just ugh.
I'm going to go back to something that I think you said, Rachel. I think you both kind of alluded to that one of the classic tropes of short fiction, I guess, would be that they sometimes feel like a snapshot, a moment in time, a little observed event. And I want to just explore a bit how we would go about turning something perhaps that we've observed or an idea that we've had, half an idea, into a story.
Okay, I'm going to take an example from Twisted Branches, which is low on spoilers, as I've already mentioned, that the main character dies in the first story. Somebody related to her and their version of the timeline and of other things. The first page of the short story that takes place in his head, I deliberately broke a rule that one of my favourite writers hates as a rule, which is keep your paragraphs reasonable. And I was in his head, and it was one moment, but it was, in terms of what happens, he had come back from the undertaker's, walked upstairs in the family house, opened the door to a balcony that the family had not used in years and years and years and years and years, and collapsed silently crying on the ground where he knew he couldn't be seen or heard, with his fist in his mouth, screaming for his mother. And this is an adult man who's just gone to the undertaker's because it's the mother's funeral, and he'd been, again with those very heavy quote marks, fine, which is something that I do find interesting. And there he is, and we know that's what's happening, and we get his memories, but the whole of that first page is his timeline, how he got to be here with no sense of what the future looks like. And in time stream terms, all you get of his future in that story is he does walk downstairs and he does have a short conversation with a family member, and somebody puts the kettle on, and a conversation is semi-had. Now, in timeline terms, that's what happened. I won't tell you what actually the content is, because that's for the story to do. But in terms of what happens, that was my structure, that was my framework, was the thoughts have somewhere to go off to and come back from. So that's one way I structure it, is be clear about what's happening in the world. This is when I'm working with point of view with clients, the way I always describe it is a shopping bag, that it doesn't matter how much you want that shopping. If it's all really heavy items, it is going to break through the bag. It's not about how beautiful they are or how valuable or how much you want them. If there's too many of them, the bag falls apart. So if you have clear structure of time and space, a lot more introspection can be carried, but it's interaction over introspection. You can do more that way. That is the phrase that I find myself repeating a lot, interaction over introspection. And that is how you keep the bag together. So that's one example of using time as the structure for that. But in different ways, that's what I'd say they're doing successfully. So if you take something very, very different, like the Lottery, Shirley Jackson, and you've got that whole village, and you gradually have that creeping realisation of what this ritual is and what's going on. But you've got generations sensed within that. You can feel the history of it, up to the point where when the shocking thing happens, you can feel that shocking thing happen. So, yeah, I'd say it's about knowing your carrier bag and using it.
And I want to go on to just think about what you've referred to and what you've produced, the linked short story cycle. What was it that inspired you to write that structure for a collection?
I really love the fact that it's such an interesting way of looking at human psychology, that it's what we do in our friendship groups and families all the time. We don't have, or we think we have, one definitive view of all the relationships that we're in and why we're right and everyone else is wrong. But the honest truth about it is we're all right by our own point of view, and we're all wrong in somebody else's, and so on. And you learn stuff as you go. And it just seemed an absolutely kind of logical way of doing that. And having those 5 generations and seeing how time passes and seeing how society sees things differently and how people see each other at different angles, I just found it absolutely captivating, and I really, really wanted to do it. So I said to my editor, Steve, how does this sound? And he said, go for it. So that's what happened. And I really loved it. I'd absolutely do more like that. It might be that if somebody feels like short stories isn't something they've got their head around, And if they are interested in multiple point of view, that is definitely something I'd recommend, because altogether now it's great fun. And it's psychologically relevant to how we live our lives. And it's also really good practice for characterisation, because I maintain that point of view is the answer to pretty much any writing question that has ever come my way, which is know whose head you're in, embrace it, and then you can always show how they're wrong to somebody else later.
Yeah.
So it does all of those things, and it allows me to explore setting, same but different, characterisation, same but different, the same plot from somebody else's angle. I think it's just beautiful.
Yeah. Well, I certainly enjoyed reading it.
I think
thank you. The check's in the post. No, I'm really glad. I'm really glad.
Yep.
Any particular short fiction collections or writers that you would like to recommend, Rachel?
So many, and feeling a bit guilty because so many of my friends are short story writers, and time is finite. So I'll go with a couple. The ones that I have found personally the most permission giving, I think that's probably what I'll bring up now, just because I think that's what we need to find as writers. What do we enjoy? What gives us permission to be our strange selves? Anything edited by Mark Morris, a Mark with a K, not my partner, that's film editor Mark Morris, book editor Mark Morris. Anything that he has edited, you will find a really diverse collection of voices, themes, really just anything that he has done. So that would be the first one. And Catherine, I think it's pronounced Heiny, not Heaney, but Heiny, is just so funny and psychologically accurate about friendship groups and families. So any of hers, my favourite collection by her is Single, Carefree, Mellow, and I just cannot recommend that highly enough in terms of not multiple points of view, but each story, first, second or third point of view, how to bring back a character later that you saw in an earlier story and go, oh my God, that's the same thing going on. And she is just so much fun. She's really interesting from a novel to short story perspective as well, just coming back to our earlier conversation, because she does write novels, but you can absolutely see how both forms work for her. So she is fascinating to have a look at.
And I guess the classic examples would be Guy de Maupassant, who really was, often considered the master of the form. O. Henry. I really enjoy Murakami's short fiction as well. Collections like The Elephant Vanishes.
Is it cheating to bring back one I know I recommended in the last series, but I just
Not at all.
have so much admiration for and I enjoy so much? Robert Shearman, a couple of years ago, We All Hear Stories in the Dark, a 3-volume choose your own adventure story where you can go through it and think this is the most horrific thing I've ever read, who is this monster, or go through it and go, oh, that's nice. And it completely depends what order you read the stories in. It's absolutely masterful. So that is one I would recommend. And also I think maybe for some people, depending on where you're coming from, that could answer the how do I do short form when I am a long form writer. Now, he does not see himself as a novelist at all. He's not interested in that. It's short stories. But working it the way he does, maybe he gets some of the things that some people might feel like they were missing otherwise, possibly.
Yeah.
And just before we come to our challenge for this episode, are there any guides to writing short fiction that our listeners might want to get hold of?
My own trumpet is about to be blown quite loudly.
Go for it.
The thing that I try to do with your creative writing toolkit is be that collection of keys to permission. And I'm very, very proud of that. It's actually being rewritten at the moment for a slightly longer form that will go in more specifically to short stories. But that is definitely a way into permission. And at the writing and editing stage, it's very practical in terms of how do I take an idea and keep moving through it and take it towards what it is trying to be. So that is something that I have used and found useful for myself and for others. I am a big fan of Stephen King on writing because he is walking the walk, and that is a dreadful thing to say about somebody who has a massive road accident in the middle of the book and couldn't finish the book at the time, and talks about how he recovered from that accident. So walking the walk perhaps is not the greatest way to say it, but that is very, very useful. Slouching Towards Bethlehem has brilliant essays on writing, and she's short fiction. Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott, if you don't own it, you need to. And best of all, until they retitled it, Margaret Atwood. It used to be called Negotiating with the Dead, because it's all about the relationship between the writer and the person doing the living, and the version of yourself that did the writing when you read it back. So they changed it to On Writers and Writing. How very tame. But in my heart, it is still called Negotiating with the Dead. And I think it really does summarise that you're always in a relationship with yourself, and your world is forever changing. And it has that spirit of humour and curiosity about how you take your writing seriously, and how you take the writing seriously rather than yourself.
Yeah.
I would read anything by Ursula Le Guin, because she's amazing, and she writes in all different forms. And her stories are incredibly fun a lot of the time.
Allegorical in so many
ways,
well.
and like metaphorical, and all of the good things. And she's just wonderful. And her books on writing are not scary. They do not lay down rules. They are all about exploring the nature of writing. You know, not getting to the nuts and bolts and you must be X to achieve Y. You know, when I read Le Guin's sort of books about writing, I feel excited and I feel like I can. And I think that's very important when you're reading something like that. It's the writers that give you permission, and it's the writers that make you brave.
Yeah.
And those are the great ingredients for a book about writing.
Indeed.
Yeah.
We should do a whole episode about our favourite books advising
About
us on
writing,
writing, shouldn't we, at some point?
Yeah.
But to end this episode, Rachel, do you have an exercise or challenge for us about short fiction, please?
This week I dare you to write one of two things: a moment in a page, or a lifetime in a paragraph.
Oof.
Wow, that really is a challenge.
The first one is kind of what I was talking about with my character, who arrives on that balcony and he's just been where he's been, and the emotion comes out and the flashback goes from there, and it was structuring it within a moment. It doesn't have to be a big moment, but it does mean doing a lot of noticing, which makes it really good writing practice for everything. It might be the moment you've got your favourite dessert in front of you and the time it takes the fork to get from the plate to your mouth. It might be getting to the shops and realising you've left your wallet at home. It can be anything. It doesn't have to be deep and meaningful. But go right in there and just give yourself a brownie point for every bit you remember and add, and just see what happens. Or a lifetime in a paragraph. I was taught this with a century in a paragraph, but I think a lifetime is more interesting because I'm very people orientated. But feel free to choose other things. And just see what happens. It's an exercise like any warm-up. It's not about it being beautiful. It's not about it being ready to publish. A warm-up is there to get you in the zone.
Yeah.
A first draft is there to get you acquainted with your ideas so that you can start everything that follows. That's what these are. That's what I'm daring you. A moment in a page, or a lifetime in a paragraph.
Wow. So, listeners, do have a go at that. Get in touch with us if you are particularly inspired.
Yes, we even have an email address now. Our email address is thewritersgym@rachelknightley.com.
Excellent. And we will publish that in our show notes. We'll also publish social media addresses so that you can get in touch with us, follow us on social media.
And let us know what topics we haven't covered that you want.
Exactly.
Yes, absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, as always, Emily and Kate,
Thank you
Rachel
very much.
Knightley, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris Gregory.
And happy short fiction writing.
To all who celebrate.
Thank you for listening to the Writer's Gym podcast with Rachel Knightley, Emily Inkpen and me, Chris Gregory. If you'd like to learn more about Rachel and the Writer's Gym, please go to rachelknightley.com. To find out more about Emily, please go to emilyinkpen.com. And for Chris, go to alternativestories.com. We'll print all these links and more in the show notes for this podcast. The Writer's Gym podcast is an Alternative Stories 2024 production for the Writer's Gym. Production, sound design and editing were by me, Chris Gregory.